My dad is the embodiment of a political junkie. Because of this, as a child, I spent my weekends watching more C-SPAN than Sesame Street. And election night in my house is the equivalent of the Superbowl in others. Which means that any question I could ever have about the intricacies of a tax bill that Congress is voting on right now, or 3 administrations ago, my dad would be my go-to for an answer. Which is strange, considering the fact that he actually grew up in Somalia, and the first election he could even vote in here as a citizen wasn't until 2004. This disconnect never really made sense to me. And in fact, led me to ask him one day, "Dad, why are you so politically aware?" And his response, well, that's actually the reason why I stand before you today. You see, my dad had always been a good student. His ultimate dream was to attend the top business school in Somalia, which he achieved after receiving a near perfect score on the university placement exam, similar to our SAT. Unfortunately, though, a few years into his college career, his circumstances drastically changed. In 1989, a year before my dad was supposed to graduate with his degree in business, there was a military coup that overthrew the Somali government, sending the entire country into perpetual civil war. As for my dad, like millions of others, he fled the country to safety, going to Canada as a refugee. For work, he got a job as a security guard in an apartment complex and decided to find any way to get a college education. After applying to schools all across Ontario, my dad started receiving all of these acceptances. But at this point, he had hit another wall. After applying to schools all across Ontario, my dad started to receive all of these acceptances. But at this point, he had hit another wall. Because he's a refugee and not a Canadian citizen, he would have to pay the hefty price of international tuition without being eligible for any financial aid or loans whatsoever. Here my dad was, having traveled halfway around the world alone, navigating in a country that is entirely foreign to him, and has spent his entire life working towards his education just to have nothing ever come of it. That was until a piece of legislation changed everything. In Ontario, an executive order was passed that allowed all refugees to pay residential in-state tuition, meaning that with a part-time job as a cab driver, my dad was able to get his degree in accounting. One piece of legislation that my dad can attribute his education, his job, and his entire livelihood to. One piece of legislation that I can attribute so many of the luxuries and opportunities that my parents have provided for me. Think of how many pieces of legislation just like this can be floating around in our state legislature as I speak. Right now, in our current political discourse, a lot of people perceive that being knowledgeable or aware of politics consists of superficial things, like having an opinion about Trump, or even seemingly impressive moves like getting CNN News alerts sent to your phone. But this is all just the tip of the iceberg. Be honest. Raise your hand if you could say the name of your representative and senator to the Michigan state legislature. See? And if you can't, you aren't alone. As I'm sure all of you know, our federal House and Senate is incredibly partisan and gridlocked, meaning that much of the legislation that is directly affecting our lives is being crafted and voted on at the state level, largely unnoticed. And I get it. As a teenager, it can be confusing and cumbersome to sit there and try to decipher what Bill SB 0393 that our state Senate is voting on is all about. But there are some ways to help break things down, and if you're passionate enough, make a difference. 1. Your news alerts from national outlets like CNN can stay. We'll couple them with some local ones that have correspondents covering what's going on in Lansing. Like, for example, the Detroit Free Press or the Macomb Daily. 2. Take 20 minutes online to do research about your representatives. from simple things like their party affiliation to their platform and stances on issues. And if you find yourself feeling passionate enough to want to address your concerns to them in person, contact their office. Because unlike at the federal level, our local reps are actually pretty accessible, and some would be willing to sit down in a coffee shop with you and debate it out. 3, and this is a big one. If you'll be 18 in November, register to vote. I remember just a couple years ago, my friends and I were so excited to get our driver's licenses and feel like adults. And here we are being presented with the opportunity to fundamentally change the course of our country's history, and many of us aren't even responding. Being the daughter of a refugee, whose dad has worked so hard to get to where he is today, I can't help but think that there could be a refugee that just came to Michigan, that is just as smart and ambitious as my dad, but because there is no law here that lets them pay anything less than international tuition, will forever be barred from achieving their dreams like my dad did. And their children never able to witness the true makings of the American dream like I did. That is unless constituents like us demand that our governor and legislature do something to change this. Oh, and I almost forgot. My dad's response as to why he's so politically aware. Well, in that moment, he looked at me in the eyes and said, in the case of that executive order that let me go back to school, there were 2 types of people that responded to the news. Those who were engaged, that helped the government prioritize the rights of refugees, and those who didn't care. And when that next big law passes that changes somebody's life like it did mine, I don't want some dad to one day tell his daughter that I was on the side of those who did not care.